And with that, I would love to just welcome everyone to tonight's Core Volunteer Training Program. It's a weekly training program that CCL offers, especially our newer volunteers. They have a chance to connect with each other and learn from each other around the larger world and really empower all of us to achieve our larger goals for climate advocacy. Now, this week's essential topic is specifically on communicating with conservatives. I'm your host, Brett Cease, and we want to thank you for making the time to join us tonight. You're going to have the chance to join CCL's legislative or conservative outreach fellow, Daniel Palken, for a training on communicating with conservatives, especially as it pertains to the Energy Innovation Act. And Daniel is going to review conservative messaging on climate change and highlight the conservative support that aligns with this bill, as well as the 5 key messages and the underlying components, really how each of those aligns with conservative values. Daniel's a graduate of Bowdoin College and is currently completing his PhD in experimental physics, so feel free to ask him anything about his subject matter, dark matter, during the Q&A as well at the University of Colorado Boulder. And starting this fall, he's also going to be on staff on climate and energy policy in the U.S. Congressional Office through a fellowship from the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. He's also a CCL co-leader of the Boulder, Colorado chapter and a conservative outreach fellow, where his focus really is engaging conservatives of all ages in support of carbon fee and dividend legislation. He's attended many conferences. He's been, speaker before. He's combined to over 50 different letters to the editor and op-eds. He's been on about a dozen podcasts. If you've heard him on some of your favorite pods, I know he's been on the speaker tour. And so with that, enough with the fanfare. Daniel, we are so grateful for all that you bring to our network. We're really looking forward to learning from you tonight, and the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us, everyone.
All right. Thank you so much, Brett. So as Brett said, I'm Dan. If my voice breaks up at all tonight, I've been told my Wi-Fi connection has been a bit spotty, so let me know and we'll figure out how to deal with that as we go, but hopefully it will be fine. So as Brett said, we're going to be talking tonight about how to communicate, how to be our most effective selves communicating with conservatives. So there's really 3 learning goals for this evening. The first takeaway that I'm gonna want folks to take away from this talk is that conservatives and liberals rely on different values when evaluating what is acceptable behavior. And I want to be very clear that there's no value judgment in that statement about values. The values that conservatives and liberals have, while different, are each valid, and people work in good faith to live them in the real world. But to be our most effective selves as volunteers and as advocates, the very best thing we can do is understand where people are coming from. And the fact that you're all on this call shows that you're all very interested in understanding how to best communicate with conservatives who might be interested in climate policy, might be convinced to become interested in climate policy. The second key takeaway by the end of the night is that we want to translate that statement about principles into a statement about how we make presentations. And I use the word presentations here, but what I really mean is, that can range from anything from actually giving a formal talk where conservatives are in the audience or comprise the audience, to just talking with friends who are conservatives or engaging on social media, on Facebook with your conservative friends and relatives, to just better understanding politics through a conservative lens, all of the above, really. And then thirdly, Brett will cover at the end that there are a lot of resources CCL has. This talk is just the beginning of a longer journey where you can learn a lot about how to effectively engage with conservatives and connect with CCL's conservative community. One of the great things about CCL is that being a bipartisan organization, we bring people from across the political spectrum together to have conversations that can be hard and in many other contexts are harder still. So the only ground rule for tonight, and this is both a ground rule for tonight and I think a theme of the presentation and a ground rule for conservative outreach, is that we will assume the best intentions in others' comments and word choices. So this is communicating across the political divide that is currently in America can be a real challenge for both conservatives and progressives and everyone in between. And the number one rule is assume that if somebody says something tonight, that they're saying it with the best intentions, and that people are always acting in good faith. Because I have the highest degree of faith that everybody who's come onto a call to take time out of their evening is in here, to do just that. So our agenda tonight, we're gonna discuss what are those differences I alluded to between conservative and liberal values, and what are the similarities as well. We're gonna rely there on the work of Jonathan Haidt, who I'll tell you a little bit more about. We're gonna then, as I said, relate those values to the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act in particular, so we can see how to translate these general principles into more specific messaging and outreach. Following that, there will be a group discussion where people will be given an opportunity to reflect on what's been said and discussed, and a presentation of some of the resources that you can access on CCL's community website. And then finally, following that, there will be a Q&A. And so please think of any questions you have and ask them ask them as Brett said. So let's start with Jonathan Haidt. So Jonathan Haidt is a professor of ethics, among other things, at New York University. And he's done a lot of really interesting work looking kind of around the core question of how do we evaluate what is acceptable for us to do? And that may sound like such a broad question that, where does climate come in a question that sounds so general? Well, it comes in because what is acceptable to do informs what policies that conservatives will be inclined to agree with that it's appropriate for government to instantiate, what kinds of political action and what kinds of speech appeal most to conservative members of an audience. So this seemingly broad-reaching question has a lot of connections to CCL, and it's no coincidence that Jonathan Haidt has been a speaker on CCL's national calls and has very kindly said that CCL is, he's said kind words about CCL to the point of us being an organization that embodies much of what he's had the opportunity to learn in his research. So his research has focused on the moral foundations of people. He's looked across cultures across the world. So we're not just talking about the US or North America here. And he's looked at how people respond to questions that give a hint at what their underlying values are. And then he's correlated his results to where people self-identify as being on the political spectrum, kind of from conservative to liberal, and again, done this around the world. And what he's found is that, he can, obviously human values and morals are very complex things, but for the sake of making a model that encapsulates a lot of what's interesting there, he's found that a lot of what people care about when they make value judgments and decisions boils down to 5, or maybe there's a 6th he's identified, kind of core moral foundations. And so those are the words in bold here, and then in parentheses are words that kind of mean they're opposite. So the first one is does an action harm someone? Does it cause harm? Most anyone, liberal or conservative, agrees that causing harm is bad. And conversely, if a policy or an action cares for someone, that is the opposite of that. However, the harm principle can at times seem to come into contradiction, and there can be disagreements between liberals and conservatives where, say, fairness is concerned. So, somebody can commit a crime which has harmful consequences. The punishment for that crime might also be harmful to the person, and different people will disagree on whether or not what kind of harm is fair to cause in response to an initial harm. And so that's another value that plays in. And fairness also has other broader meanings in the context of these values. Thirdly, we have in-group loyalty. So standing with whoever you identify as the in-group. And that can be anything from your family, a group you're in. It can be Citizens Climate Lobby. It could be the country as a whole, more broadly speaking. But this is and there's real room for disagreement on these values. So I've heard someone say that a person I know in CCL said that in talking about in-group loyalty in this context, somebody once said to them, "Nothing good's ever come of that." So it's not necessarily the case that everyone agrees that these are all purely good things, but these are kind of the values around which judgments center for various liberals or conservatives. Then fourthly, we have authority. So obeying tradition and forms of legitimate authority, in some cases governments. And then lastly, we have purity, which can manifest in the negative as a dislike of things that kind of cause a disgust reaction. So this can be something as mundane as a food that one doesn't like or is allergic to, or it can be conversely, there can be a reaction of purity to something which is very positive, or which one views as very positive. So we could be talking about the Bible or a flag here that somebody could view as very, very pure and sacred, and that could inform their judgments and their politics. And then lastly, there's this one of liberty, and the opposite of that being oppression or tyranny. And we won't really get into that as much in this talk. Okay. So I alluded earlier to the fact that Jonathan Haidt's research works to correlate how much people report themselves as caring about some of these values on a kind of 0 to 5 scale versus where they identify on the political spectrum, ranging all the way from strongly liberal to strongly conservative. And as a scientist myself, what's really interesting about these curves is that these lines showing each of the 5 values we discussed is that for all 5 of them, there's like a very clear trend. They don't just hop around. It's not like neutral people are kind of up here and then it goes back down for conservatives. They all kind of follow this linear trend. And what they show is that all 5 of these values, the more and more people identify as conservative or liberal, the more or less they prioritize the given values. And so, when I look at this plot, what I'm a little bit less concerned with the absolute value is that the absolute value of these matters a bit less when looking at this, and the relative value between conservatives and liberals can be very illuminating. So, on the relative scale, liberals care a lot about fairness and harm. And if you watch where my mouse is, you'll see where I'm kind of highlighting on the plot. And then, well, fairness and harm still are self-reported to matter a lot for conservatives. Conservatives relative to liberals care a lot about these other 3, which is in-group loyalty, authority, and purity. And we'll talk a bit, and I think a basic model, if you're a progressive on this call and you haven't done a lot of engagement with conservatives, or you're a conservative, a lot of is the base assumption, it's not a bad guess that, assuming you're a relatively representative member of your political group, your priors on where to start, giving a presentation will be where the progressives or where the conservatives are. So a progressive will kind of start out thinking, okay, this is how I think in the world, this is how I reason. So I want to give a presentation that really caters especially to these values and won't weight as highly these other moral foundations. And conversely, for conservatives speaking to progressives, and through the lens of Jonathan Haidt's work, this is where a lot of miscommunication between conservatives and progressives can happen. I'll click through those animations. And so, as an example of this, we'll start with in-group loyalty versus betrayal. So this is a slide, this is a picture of former Vice President Al Gore, who founded the Climate Reality Project in order to take action on climate change. And in this example, if you're going to a progressive group and giving a presentation and you have the Climate Reality Project logo on the bottom of all your slides, and a picture of Al Gore or something, what you'll be saying to the group implicitly is, this man who was the vice president for the Democratic Party, who tried to run against the Republican nominee in 2000, this is kind of the message I'm putting out. And independent of the content of the slides, which can be very strong, you'll be signaling a kind of outgroupness, which can ultimately harm the message you're trying to convey, independent of even its content. And its content is, of course, very important. But so conversely, what you might want to do is, there's strong climate champions that you can find on the conservative side as well. And so these are James Baker and George Shultz, who are right-hand men to Ronald Reagan, here seen with him. And they champion a climate policy that's not so dissimilar from ours. In fact, George Shultz has endorsed the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act and is on CCL's board. And so giving, to a conservative audience or talking to a conservative friend or in a letter to the editor in a conservative publication, leading with George Shultz, it's as simple as that over a liberal figure, can make a very big difference in signaling a connection to the group. This also applies when talking about the issues in their particulars. So, a common theme in any climate talk, certainly in climate talks I give, is talking about the issues that affect us because of climate change. That's ultimately all why we're here. And so this is a photo taken of flooding that's happened in Bangladesh. And it's with liberals or conservatives, it's more than fine to talk about the negative impacts of climate change. That's a persuasive argument to a lot of people. But talking about one in a faraway land, even if it's very tragic, can miss the mark sometimes with a conservative audience. And so when I give a talk to conservative audiences, I'll usually use a picture that's very local to me. And so I can't say what that is for where you live, that's local is. But with me, there was a flood that happened. I live in Boulder, Colorado. This is a mountain town that I love to go to their little cafe, and I love to listen to live music there and go on runs up in the town. It's Jamestown, Colorado, and a lot of it was wiped out in a flood in 2013. This photo is actually taken from an Army helicopter flown by the 4th Infantry Division out of Fort Carson as it flew over the town surveying the damage. And I mean, it's just absolutely tragic, and it's 10 miles from where I live, and it's a town where, you know, I love the people and I love going there. And it strikes, I think, very close to home, quite to a conservative audience. Conservative politics can often be very local, and you know, communicating that is the right move to do, and also, you know, a way to show that you and your audience connect on a lot of the same values and priorities. So it's, you know, and it's not to say you can't talk about things that happen far away. It's just good to make a connection to life at home when doing so. So this is a shipping container ship that was hit by a big storm north of Germany, and it lost 200 shipping containers. And as you can see in the photo, a lot of the others were damaged. And a way to fold this into a presentation is to say, you know, this clearly, it's very easy to see how this affects local economies everywhere where these shipping containers were being delivered, but are now instead at the bottom of the ocean because of a storm, the likes of which we're apt to see more of because of a changing climate. Similar story, this is a Honda plant in Thailand that was flooded. And that affected local business in a lot of parts of the US, because local businesses that deal Hondas or partner with them were all of a sudden, this plant and others like it had to be closed. And then lastly, here's an example from even another part of the US. So I live in Colorado. Colorado is the highest elevation state in the country on average. So the last thing you would think we would have to worry about is sea level rise. But, you know, this is a photo of flooding that happened in Miami, Florida. And, you know, one issue that Coloradans really, you know, if a Coloradan says, well, why should I care about sea level rise? Well, an issue that a lot of Coloradans care about is kind of the rapid influx of people to the state. It's kind of strained a lot of our highway systems and a lot of our infrastructure. And, you know, one contribution to the influx of a lot of populations from other states to our state is the fact that a lot of people are being forced to move away from coasts, and that will become more and more of an issue as climate change exacerbates. So all of these are to say, you know, if you want to talk about a faraway issue, relate it to home, or talk about the issues at home. And then a third aspect that I want to hit on of this in-group loyalty moral foundation is to make a connection on kind of the issue itself of fossil fuels. So actually, when giving a talk to conservative audiences, I always like to start with this slide, which is an odd slide to start with in a climate talk. If you're going to say, you know, usually climate talks center around how we very much need very quickly to get rid of fossil fuels, and ultimately that is the upshot of climate policy, including ours, that it will transition us off fossil fuels expediently. But I always start with a slide showing, you know, that when I look at a picture of and this is very true for me, of a coal mine or a natural gas refinery, there's something very beautiful about it to me, because it not only signifies some of the complications and damages those fuels have done to us, it also signifies the dignified jobs they've provided to Americans and the role that they've played in our communities. In showing that you understand that, even if the ultimate upshot of your talk is that fossil fuels have a carbon content that we need to work to mitigate, shows that you have a common moral grounding and a common awareness of some of the possible hazards of work in this space that you can all then agree to work to keep in mind while creating productive policy. So, you know, there's a lot more resources I can point you to on in-group loyalty versus betrayal. I'm going to leave, you know, this presentation, you can go to the slides with the link that was on the first page, and I'll ask Brett to maybe share that again in the chat for people. I encourage you to go on these slides and click on these links. I think there's a lot of worthwhile reading here. I've highlighted this one in particular in red, which we'll come back to. So authority versus subversion is another one where conservatives rate the authority value higher than liberals. I'm showing kind of some contrasting images, which I think would be fair to say would excite very different responses in a progressive versus a conservative in the context of a discussion on climate change. In the top two pictures, I'm showing, you know, photos related to the military, which have to do with climate. Here's a U.S. military vehicle trying to drive through some truly terrific floodwaters, and here are troops at the border where immigration is an issue that's very impacted by climate as people from other countries move across borders in part because of strains from climate change. And then here in the bottom is school strikes, where students have left school for the day to protest for climate change. Talking about the upper two panels can hit the mark more with a conservative audience, because you're talking about, you can also combine that with statements from prominent military leaders like Jim Mattis, who have come out and said, we need to take action, we need a price on carbon. Whereas talking about the lower panels might be very effective for a progressive audience, but might strike the wrong note with a conservative audience, who might see this as an act of subversion and skipping out on school rather than an act in favor of the planet. So more resources for you to look into. Again, if you have an opportunity to click through these slides on authority versus subversion, I'll leave those to you after. And then we get to sanctity versus degradation. So something that may be very sacred to a lot of people, especially a lot of conservatives, but any American, is the American flag. And I think this image on the right really encapsulates, I'm not at all certain that this man was trying to persuade any conservatives of his premise, but if he was, this would be a very bad way to do it. He's taken the flag and he's draped it about him as a costume, and he has a big match, and he's showing how, we're lighting the earth on fire. There's a powerful message in there, but to a conservative, it would often be lost in kind of the defiling of a sacred object, that being the American flag. Conversely, there's instances where protests, many led by liberals, have done a very good job at I think excelling on this purity and sanctity moral foundation. So this is at the March for Science, which if I guessed, I would say is an event largely attended by more left-leaning folk. But you can see the flag here is featured very prominently and respectfully waving at the front of the march. And I think if I had to guess which of these, if seen by a conservative audience, would do a better job at exciting, positive reaction or a curious reaction rather than a negative one, I would say the photo where the flag is being treated respectfully. And it's something as simple as that. So more resources for you to look into on this front. There's a lot of groups, some of which are progressive groups, but which have a lot of inroads with religious communities, for example, Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. There's a Good Citizens Climate Radio episode on the Bible, which I'd encourage you to look into. And I'd really encourage you to look at, if you haven't already, what Katherine Hayhoe has to say when she talks about faith and climate. She's a really great speaker there. So we returned to this plot I showed earlier. And so what I just want you to take away from this is that conservatives and liberals, first, I think what's gone understated in this is that everybody across the political spectrum also has a lot in common. A lot of people do at some level respond to the same thing. So this isn't to say, we're two totally different groups. Conservatives and liberals are two totally different groups of people, but there are differences that are important to understand when trying to communicate a message in a political environment such as the one that surrounds climate change. And I hope by talking about the authority, purity, and in-group loyalty virtues, I've shown a little bit of what that can look like. So now let's connect that a little bit more directly to talking about the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which is ultimately what we're all here as members of CCL to support. So CCL's core messaging around the EICDA, which I think is it's very good messaging for people to take away in just a few words, and it really sticks in people's heads, is that it's effective, it's good for people, it's good for the economy, it's bipartisan, and it's revenue neutral. And so that's a great place to start. But in the context of this talk, where we're really digging into how to message to conservatives, we want to dig in a bit further to how you might talk about these issues in the context of talking about our bill. And by the way, I think this slide's a little outdated. This was the previous introduction of the bill in the last Congress. It's now, as we know, HR 763. So the first, a first really useful tool when having policy-centric conversations I've found, especially to conservative audiences, is this amazing economist statement on carbon dividends. Now, carbon dividends is a very closely related policy to ours. The differences are really in some of the numbers in the two policies, but the carbon dividends policy has exactly the same framework as ours. It's a carbon fee coupled with a dividend, a border adjustment, and then some limited regulatory adjustment in exchange for that. And the Climate Leadership Council, the group that is kind of championing this policy, this carbon dividends policy, orchestrated a really amazing coalition of economists, including 27 Nobel laureates, 15 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors to the president. And we're talking about all presidents who are in living memory here. So not just the Democratic Obama and Clinton, but also the top people who worked for Ford, Reagan, and both Bushes. Former secretaries of the Treasury and former chairs of the Fed, all of the living former chairs of the Fed, all signed on to this statement, saying that not only is a price on carbon not only is a price on carbon an effective solution for climate change, it is the most cost-effective one. And for many people listening to the economic experts, that can be a trusted in-group. That can be a group that plays a kind of parallel role to scientists, to the role that a lot of scientists play, especially on the progressive side of the conversation looking at this problem. A lot of people who are skeptical of the effects on the economy will take as a strong signal the fact that ultimately 3,500 professional economists, left, right, and center, came down with unified voice and said, this is a policy that is worth our that is really worth supporting. Secondly, another point to talk about with conservatives is that there really is a strong conservative tradition of conserving, as the name suggests. Teddy Roosevelt and the national parks, President Nixon signed the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts into existence, and Ronald Reagan negotiated the Montreal Protocol to protect the ozone layer with the cap and trade system, not so different from our own market-based mechanism for addressing climate change. And this document I alluded to earlier that I had highlighted in that light red, I've linked here again. I've put together, if anybody is interested in making use of it, a set of quotes from kind of a mixture of prominent Republicans, some who are just kind of current members of Congress, all of whom have said things supportive of addressing climate change or climate action. There's a big spread into what degree the people on these quote lists are themselves climate champions. You'll find people who are not climate champions but have said a thing or two which they can be reminded of to move them in the direction of climate championship, all the way to conservatives who are just out and out work very hard towards our climate. So to share a few quotes from these lists, and Ronald Reagan once said, many laws protecting environmental quality have promoted liberty by securing property against the destructive trespass of pollution. So that's that sixth value we didn't really get to, which is that liberty versus tyranny moral foundation. And nobody was really better at communicating with conservatives than Ronald Reagan. Francis Rooney, who's one of he's the Republican co-sponsor on the Energy Innovation Act, wrote in an op-ed, "I'm a conservative Republican and I believe climate change is real. It's time for my fellow Republicans in Congress to stop treating this environmental threat as something abstract and political and recognize that it's already affecting their constituents in their daily lives." So, being armed with these quotes, they can be, be wary of know the person who you're quoting, know the context of the quote. There's links to all of them that you can click on if you go to these quote handout pages, but can be very useful things in informing yourself on what's been said, and also on putting together presentations, on writing, on having discussions with policymakers, and so forth. Lastly, you also, I think we've talked a bit about the harms of climate change and how to message around those. It's also very important to message around success stories, and particularly local success stories. I think, liberal or conservative, a very effective thing that we need to do more of is to present a promising vision of the future, where not only do we address climate change and stop negative effects, but we live in a cleaner and healthier world where our land and water is cleaner. For me, this story might personally look like my brother has taken a job at a wind farm assembling wind turbines, and he really feels valued in that work. He feels like he's contributing to a part of society that he wants to see flourish, and it's in many ways very analogous to the photos I showed earlier, speaking to the dignified work of a lot of fossil fuel workers. And this is kind of the vision for a world that we can present and be clear that all people have a role in sculpting. And so telling those success stories and presenting a positive vision of the future is a key part of, underlies our ability to live all of those values. Then we get to the dividend, which is, I think this is a kind of key part in any CCL talk, where you'll invariably come to having to present the fact that after taking in the money from the carbon tax, the money is then given back to individuals. And in a kind of typical CCL talk to perhaps a more progressive audience, the dividend can often be presented as, this is a progressive program. People in lower income brackets are actually going to come out ahead because of the dividend. And that's no doubt true. But to a conservative audience, that could ring of wealth redistribution in a way which isn't equitable or fair. There's ways to present the dividend which are very true to what the policy is, which will land much better on conservative ears. So, one way I've heard this done that I've really found resonant is that the dividend is kind of a policy aspect around personal choices and responsibility. People whose choices lead them to emit less will make out better because of it financially. The dividend is essentially a reward for good carbon behavior. There's an analogy here to the national debt when talking about climate, which is another issue that many conservatives care deeply about, which is with the national debt. Many conservatives' moral objection to it is we're leaving a big burden on our children. We're kind of taking a loan out, and our children are the ones who will have to pay for it. In those terms, climate change can also be phrased and framed in exactly those terms. We're polluting now, and the major effects of climate change, even bigger than what we're seeing, will come in subsequent generations, the one after us and the one after that. And that's a debt that we're leaving our children. And in the same way that it's irresponsible to leave a large fiscal debt, it's irresponsible to leave a large climate debt. So, I want to lastly say, or near lastly say, that when giving a talk to conservatives, if we're talking about the context of maybe giving a presentation here, it's not always enough if your audience is really conservative to just throw in one or two slides that shows a conservative value. You really want to really think from the ground up and ruthlessly eliminate anything else in your slide deck. If I was giving a presentation to cat lovers and I let off with this nice slide about a cat, but then when the rest of the presentation filled in, it looked more like this, the cat lovers, ultimately, would have reason to question whether I really had the interest of cats at heart. And so giving a presentation which kind of from top to bottom showcases conservative values and communicates to them can be a hard thing to do the first time, can also be a very positive learning experience and a very productive thing to do. So that concludes the main part of the presentation. I hope everybody's enjoyed this. I would appreciate if people could break up in groups of 2 or 3 for 3 minutes to share some of the pieces of tonight's presentation that you found most useful or least useful, if you like. And think to yourself and say to your partner or partners, when talking to conservatives, whether giving a presentation or in personal dialogue or in a congressional office, I will add this to the things I would otherwise say, and also I will remove this. What are the thises in those statements? What do you think you'll add to your normal way of speaking, and what do you think you'll subtract from your normal way of speaking when you speak to, if your normal way of speaking is speaking to progressives? If you are already a person who speaks to conservatives, are there still changes you would make?
No worries. So basically, we've got a couple of additional resources on Community. You're welcome to use any of these. This one is specifically in groups, so especially if you are in a chapter that's really looking to do outreach with conservative membership. That's one I'll just put again in the chat here. And all of these, again, are on CCL Community. So this is a different one. You can go forward to the next one. And again, I agree with what Tamara put in the chat. It was great to see everyone's faces. If you yourself or others that lean conservative and are looking for a climate org, obviously, that is really trying to fit your values, but also is, focused on discussions around that. We do have a conservative caucus, and our conservative outreach director is basically kind of always inviting other people, welcoming right of center members and left of center friends. So either way, and that is featured here. You can go to our action teams, and that is found if you go to the Connect with Others drop-down menu in Community. And then from there, click on the action team option if you want to click one more time, Daniel. And then from there, you can see that there's robust discussions in the forums, just like we have in our Climate Advocate Training Program for the summer. You can click again. And Jim just wanted to highlight, again, there's a lot more resources as well. So even if you didn't join the group, a lot of what Daniel highlighted here are additional PowerPoint presentations people have put together for their own conservative audience presentations, some specific additional statements, Daniel's quote cards. All of those are highlighted there on the home page, the more info section of that caucus that I just put in the chat for the Conservative Caucus Action Team. And I think there's one more, and then we'll go to Q&A. And that one is just highlighting if you haven't seen or aren't familiar yet with one of our other advisory board members, the wonderful Dr. Catherine Haidt. She is an atmospheric scientist, is a professor down at Texas Tech in Lubbock, and is also an evangelical Christian. And she has given multiple keynotes for us, but does a wonderful job of weaving in the faith elements to the importance of taking action on climate change. And so at this point, we'll definitely highlight the importance of checking her out if you haven't seen that beforehand.
Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. I really hope people got something out of this, and that it informs your outreach. Feel free to shoot me an email. I'm pretty busy these days. I'm writing my dissertation for my PhD, but I will get back to you if you write me an email eventually, I promise. So thank you so much.
Thank you. That was a brilliant talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming. Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.